A machine so accurate, it made an entire category of tooling obsolete. A patent cartel that sued its own founder to take his greatest invention. A federal judge who declared the whole arrangement illegal. And a group of financiers who dragged the company's name through bankruptcy court 3 times in 13 years. The DeVlieg Machine Company of Royal Oak, Michigan, lived all of it inside a single lifetime. At the center of the story sits the Spear-O-Matic Rigidmil, a horizontal boring mill so precise that the machinists who ran them still argue nothing else ever felt quite like one. The very first jig mill now rests in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. However, the road that machine traveled to get there runs through a betrayal in Atlantic City, a federal courtroom in Detroit, and one of the strangest corporate collapses in the history of American manufacturing. You're watching Trade Archive. Before we go back to Grand Rapids in 1892, take 1 second to hit the like button and subscribe, because stories like this one are vanishing faster than the factories that made them. Charles Benjamin DeVlieg was born in 1892 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the 9th child of Dutch immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic from the farm country of Groningen. His parents were both deaf and mute. Picture that household for a moment. A crowded West Michigan home at the turn of the century, where the parents communicated with their hands, and where a boy's future depended entirely on work that nobody could talk their way into. Whatever Charles learned about the world, he learned by watching how things were actually done, not by being told. People who worked with him decades later described a man who trusted his eyes and his hands over anyone's promises, and who had no patience whatsoever for waiting. Both traits trace straight back to that silent house in Grand Rapids. He walked out of school at 14 and into a machine shop as an apprentice machinist. That was the standard path for a working-class kid in industrial Michigan. But DeVlieg burned through it fast and got restless standing at a machine all day. He worked his way onto the design side of the trade and became a tool designer at the Ford Motor Company, right as Henry Ford's Highland Park operation was inventing modern mass production in front of the whole world. From Ford, he moved to Dodge Brothers as an assistant master mechanic, running tool room work for one of Detroit's most demanding manufacturers. And by 1917, he was works manager at Kearney and Trecker in Milwaukee, one of the most respected milling machine builders in the country. And this was no lucky climb. Detroit in the 1910s was the most competitive manufacturing environment on the planet, a city where thousands of toolmakers chased the same drafting jobs, and DeVlieg kept getting picked. The men doing the picking, at Ford, at Dodge, at Kearney and Trecker, were betting entire production lines on his judgment. It was at Kearney and Trecker that DeVlieg designed something of his own, a bed-type milling machine built around a simple obsession: rigidity. A milling machine that flexes even a hair under load, leaves chatter marks on the work, and shakes itself out of accuracy. DeVlieg wanted a machine stiff enough to climb cut, a technique where the rotating cutter pulls itself into the workpiece instead of pushing against it. Climb cutting leaves a beautiful surface finish, but on a loose machine, it can grab the part and wreck the job, so the machine has to be massively rigid with no backlash anywhere in its screws. In the mid-1920s, he took the design to the Sundstrand Machine Tool Company of Rockford, Illinois. Sundstrand liked it, hired him to put it into production, and sold it under a name that told you exactly what it was: the Rigidmil. The name on the casting was Sundstrand's. The thinking inside it was his. DeVlieg spent 3 years at Sundstrand watching another company profit from his ideas. So in 1928, at 36 years old, he quit and bet on himself. The first DeVlieg Machine Tool Company was set up to design and sell milling machines, while a contract builder handled the actual manufacturing. He hired a Michigan firm, the Walcott Machine Company, to build his machines, but within a year, Walcott went out of business underneath him. So in 1929, DeVlieg bought a factory building of his own and started making the machines himself. His timing could not possibly have been worse. The stock market crashed in October of that same year. Capital spending across American industry fell off a cliff, and machine tools were the first purchase every factory canceled. The Depression strangled the young company, and it died. That is usually where the story ends for men like this. a failed founder pushing 40, in the worst economy in American history, in an industry where nobody was buying anything at all. But DeVlieg did something quieter and smarter. Together with his eldest son, Charles Russell DeVlieg, a young man everybody called Bud, he opened a small engineering shop. The DeVlieg Engineering Company had no factory and no product line, just drafting tables and know-how, and father and son kept it alive on design work straight through the worst years of the Depression. Around them, orders for new machine tools had all but evaporated. Storied builders were dying across Ohio and New England, and skilled machinists were standing in bread lines in Detroit. A design office with no factory, no inventory, and almost no overhead turned out to be exactly the right size of boat for that storm. And while the little shop paid the bills, Charles refined the ideas he had been carrying around for a decade. By 1933, he held 3 patents that mattered enormously: a backlash eliminator, an automatic power transmission mechanism, and an automatic positioning device. Nearly every machine tool builder in the country could use inventions like these. DeVlieg had no way to build machines himself anymore, so he sold access instead. On September 3, 1931, he granted the Lucas Machine Tool Company of Cleveland an exclusive license covering horizontal boring, drilling, and milling machines. In October 1932, the Carlton Machine Tool Company took drilling machines, and Lodge and Shipley took lathes. Brown and Sharpe of Providence, Rhode Island signed a non-exclusive deal that November. Then, in August 1933, the arrangement hardened into something much bigger. DeVlieg and the manufacturers created a patent holding company in Cincinnati called Associated Patents, Incorporated. Everyone assigned the DeVlieg patents into the pool, everyone agreed to hand over any future improvements they developed, and everyone received an exclusive field of use. Lucas got horizontal boring machines. Carlton got drills. Lodge and Shipley got lathes. And Charles DeVlieg, the inventor whose patents built the entire structure, was confined to milling and broaching machines. On paper, it was a licensing arrangement. In practice, as a federal court would later spell out in cold detail, the members had also arrived at a general unwritten agreement not to compete with each other at all, whether the pooled patents were involved or not. The court record preserves a remarkable example of how deep it went. In March 1934, DeVlieg visited the Brown and Sharpe plant in Providence and was shown confidential drawings of their upcoming No. 12 milling machine, because pool members trusted each other with secrets. The two sides had an understanding that Brown and Sharpe would build the small milling machines, and DeVlieg would build the large ones. So when DeVlieg later designed a machine that would have competed with the No. 12, Brown and Sharpe protested, and DeVlieg shelved a completed design out of deference to the arrangement. He had survived the Depression by turning his patents into a cartel. The price was a cage. He could no longer build what he wanted to build without asking permission from the men who held the other keys. By 1939, he was done asking. That year, at 47 years old, he founded the DeVlieg Machine Company in a plant on Fair Avenue in Ferndale, Michigan, on Detroit's northern edge. The first product was a machine called the Rigidmil, built to mill the vanes of aircraft engine superchargers, and it turned out blades roughly 15 times faster than the methods it replaced. For once in his life, the timing was perfect. Europe was already at war. American aircraft production was accelerating toward numbers nobody had thought possible, and a machine that made supercharger blades 15 times faster suddenly mattered a very great deal. Surviving serial numbers suggest only about 29 Rigidmils were ever built between 1940 and 1944, but they carried the young company, and they put DeVlieg's name in front of the men running America's war production. The Ferndale plant itself was nothing grand, a modest brick industrial building on Fair Avenue, but inside it a 20-year-old idea about rigidity was finally paying rent. In 1941, the War Production Board came to Ferndale with a request: drop the specialty work and concentrate on horizontal boring, drilling, and milling machines, the heavy precision equipment the war effort was desperately short of. And it was in this crush of wartime orders that the defining moment of Charles DeVlieg's life arrived, disguised as a scheduling problem. His own shop needed 2 new horizontal boring machines to keep up with the workload, and when he tried to buy them, he was quoted a delivery time of 18 months. Every builder in the country was buried. The government was rationing machine tools like ammunition, factories were running 3 shifts, and a plant that could not bore accurate holes could not make aircraft engines, gun mounts, or much of anything else. 18 months in the middle of a war, quoted to a man who had been designing machine tools since Ford ran on belts and line shafts. DeVlieg refused to wait. He designed and built his own. The machine he built was so good that, as the story has been told in the trade ever since, he sold 3 of them before he managed to keep one for his own shop floor. By 1943, 2 prototypes were running, and what they could do sounded almost like a trick. To understand why, you have to know what a jig is. When a shop needed to bore holes in precise positions, it first built a jig, a custom hardened steel fixture that physically guided the cutting tools, one expensive jig for every single job. Jigs devoured money, added weeks of lead time, and filled entire storage rooms in every plant in America. DeVlieg's machine positioned its own spindle and table so accurately, to within 1/10,000th of an inch, that for a huge range of work, the jig simply became unnecessary. Think about what that meant inside a wartime plant. The jig department, with its planners, its toolmakers, and its months of lead time, could be bypassed for job after job. A part could come off the drawing board in the morning and be on the machine that afternoon. In an economy where output was measured in bombers per month, that was not a convenience. That was a weapon. He called it the Rigidmil, the world's first jigless borer, and he filed for a patent on September 29, 1942. United States Patent 2,391,398 was issued on Christmas Day, 1945, in the name of Charles B. DeVlieg. And one detail on that document would come to matter enormously. It carried no assignee. The patent belonged to him alone. The accuracy was not a marketing claim either. The ways the machine slid on were finished by hand scraping, a craftsman working cast iron with a hand tool to 1/10,000th of an inch per foot of travel. The spindle bar was ground and hand-lapped to 500,000ths of an inch or better, riding in precision Timken taper roller bearings. Even the smallest jig mill weighed 13,000 pounds, and the biggest ones passed 40,000, because DeVlieg had learned long ago that accuracy begins with mass. The positioning system, which he named Duplitrol, used drilled steel bars, hardened stop pins, and dial indicators, so that an operator could press a button marked auto position and watch the table drive itself to a stop within a tenth. The system ran on nothing more exotic than relays, micro switches, and compressed air, and the table finished every move with a slow, controlled creep around the target before clamping itself down so gently that the final position never shifted. Operators came to love it for the same reason they loved everything else on the machine. Every control fell naturally to hand, every feed and rapid ran off a button, and the whole enormous mass answered like a precision instrument. Push-button automatic positioning, delivered years before anyone in the industry was saying the words numerical control. There was just one problem, and DeVlieg had known it from the first pencil line. Horizontal boring, drilling, and milling machines were Lucas territory, the exclusive field the cartel had granted to Cleveland back in 1933. So before building anything, DeVlieg did exactly what the arrangement required of him. He traveled to Cleveland and showed Lucas his preliminary drawings. In July 1941, Henry M. Lucas himself visited the Ferndale plant, inspected the design work in progress, and took a full set of drawings home with him to Ohio. That December, he came back and stood in the plant watching the first machine run. The two men then reached an understanding that federal court findings would later record in plain language. The Lucas machine carried its spindle parallel to the bed. The Rigidmil carried its spindle at right angles to the bed. Each man agreed to stay out of the other's configuration, and on that handshake, the Rigidmil went to war. It succeeded beyond anything DeVlieg had built in his life. American plants boring aircraft fittings, gun mounts, and engine housings found they could skip the jig room entirely and go straight to the machine. And that success changed the arithmetic over in Cleveland. In 1945, with the war ending and the shape of the post-war machine tool market coming into focus, Lucas turned on him. The company notified DeVlieg that the jig mill violated its exclusive rights under the pool agreement, accused him of infringing 2 additional Lucas patents that had never even been assigned to the pool, and then made the demand that revealed what this was really about. Lucas claimed the jig mill patent itself was an improvement under the terms of the 1933 agreement, which meant DeVlieg was obligated to sign his masterpiece over to Associated Patents, where every member of the cartel would share in it. In April 1947, at a directors' meeting in Atlantic City, New Jersey, the members of the pool voted to back Lucas against the man whose inventions had created the pool in the first place. Settlement talks followed through the summer, but they collapsed over the one condition the cartel refused to drop: hand over the jig mill patent. DeVlieg refused. So on July 16, 1947, Associated Patents and Lucas filed suit against Charles DeVlieg and his companies in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, demanding damages and a court order forcing him to assign patent 2,391,398 to the pool. The cage he had built to survive the Depression had finally closed on the man who built it. He was 55 years old. He had spent 16 years watching other companies grow on his inventions while the pool dictated what he was allowed to build. And now the one machine that was entirely his, conceived at his own drafting table, proven on his own floor, patented in his own name, was being claimed by men who had watched him build it and shaken his hand on it. The case ground on for years while jig mills kept shipping out of Ferndale. Then the United States government arrived and changed the question entirely. The Department of Justice sued the whole pool under the antitrust laws, and in United States versus Associated Patents, decided in June 1955, a federal judge in Michigan ruled that the entire arrangement, the exclusive fields, the mandatory assignment of improvements, the quiet handshake agreements not to compete, amounted to an unreasonable restraint of trade in violation of the Sherman Act. The agreement was declared illegal and void, and Associated Patents was ordered dissolved. As for the cartel's 1947 lawsuit against DeVlieg, the public record simply goes quiet. No published decision, no reported settlement, nothing that historians have ever been able to find. What we do know is this: the legal foundation of the demand had just been declared void by a federal court, and patent 2,391,398 never carried an assignee for as long as it lived. Charles DeVlieg kept the jig mill. It stands as one of the quieter vindications in American industrial history. The government never set out to rescue him, and the case that freed him was aimed at a practice, not a person. What followed was 3 decades of the kind of dominance that machine tool people still talk about. The microbore boring tool, which DeVlieg had patented in 1946 because he could not buy tooling accurate enough for his own machine, grew into a complete precision tooling system sold across the entire industry. The jig mill line expanded from the original 3B through the bigger 4B in the late 40s and the compact 2B in 1955, then onward through the H, J, and K series and into numerically controlled versions. In 1960, the company moved from Fair Avenue in Ferndale to a larger plant on Fair Street in Royal Oak, Michigan. The customer list read like a map of Cold War America. Boeing ran jig mills on aircraft work. Chrysler's missile division advertised in the Detroit newspapers for experienced DeVlieg operators. Die shops across metropolitan Detroit lined them up in rows, and Warner and Swazi alone ran more than 30 of them. Alfred Herbert, then the largest machine tool builder in Britain, took a license and built jig mills at Lutterworth in England for markets across the Eastern Hemisphere. Even the model system tells you how the company thought. The first digit was the spindle diameter in inches, and the second number was the table travel, so a 3B48 carried a 3-inch spindle over 48 inches of table. Buyers specified a jig mill the way they specified a bridge crane, by the size of the work, and the accuracy came standard at every size. Among the men who ran them, the machine acquired something close to a cult. Operators reported holding 0.5 of an inch across 6 feet of travel, all day, every day. Every table was finished like an inspection-grade surface plate. One veteran machinist put the feeling into a single line, saying the DeVliegs made turret mills look like toys. Shops that owned them treated the tables like inspection equipment because they effectively were. The T-slots were located precisely enough to set work against, and the cross slots ran at a dead 90 degrees, so a DeVlieg hand often needed nothing but the machine itself to set up a job that would have taken a morning of indicating anywhere else. Charles DeVlieg spent his final years giving the money away. In 1961, he established the DeVlieg Foundation to fund engineering education, and in April 1973, he died at his home in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, at 81 years old. He had watched his machine grow from a wartime improvisation into the backbone of American precision boring, and he lived long enough to give a fortune of it away. The industry generally puts total jig mill production somewhere around 4,500 machines, and in 1984, the American Precision Museum inducted him into the Machine Tool Hall of Fame. The first jig mill went on display at the Henry Ford's Greenfield Village in Dearborn, still tooled up with micro-bore heads, a wartime machine preserved like a Stradivarius. And in 1981 came a detail so perfectly ironic it belongs in a novel. Demand for jig mills was running so far ahead of the Royal Oak plant's capacity that the order backlog had stretched to 18 months, and the English factory at Lutterworth began shipping 2 finished machines a month across the Atlantic just to plug the gap. 18 months. The exact wait that had driven Charles DeVlieg to build the machine in the first place. His company had become the very bottleneck its founder refused to accept. There were worse problems for a company to have, and in the trade press, it read as pure strength. But while the order books were full, the ground underneath them was already moving, and the men who came for DeVlieg next did not carry micrometers. The 1980s hollowed out the American machine tool industry with brutal speed. Japanese builders were shipping CNC machining centers that did much of what a jig mill did at a fraction of the price. The strong dollar made imports irresistible, and the customers, Detroit above all, were bleeding. DeVlieg adapted longer than many, even partnering with Okuma of Japan on a line of CNC machines sold under both names. But by the middle of the decade, the company founded in 1939 had become exactly the kind of asset that attracted a new species of American businessman: the financial operator. Across the industrial Midwest in those years, the same movie played on a loop. An old line manufacturer with a strong name, valuable property, and an underfunded future would be acquired with borrowed money, reorganized on paper, and separated from its liabilities with surgical care. The machines and the workers were rarely the point. The balance sheet was the point. Between 1987 and 1988, control of DeVlieg passed to Stanwich Partners, a Connecticut investment firm run by Charles E. Bradley, John G. Poole, and Lawrence de France. The business was folded together with the remains of Sundstrand's machine tool operations, the same Sundstrand that had built DeVlieg's Rigidmil 60 years earlier, and renamed DeVlieg Sundstrand, later simply DeVlieg, Incorporated. In 1989, jig mill production in Royal Oak came to an end after roughly 45 years of continuous manufacture. And in December of that year, the Stanwich men executed the transaction that would keep federal courts busy for most of the next decade. They sold DeVlieg's operating subsidiaries to another company they themselves controlled, a Delaware entity that had started life as Stanwich Industries and was renamed that very month DeVlieg Bullard, Incorporated. The Bullard half of the name came from another fallen giant, the Bullard Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut, a vertical lathe builder more than a century old whose remains Stanwich had also collected. In March 1990, DeVlieg Bullard went public on the strength of those businesses, which it had purchased for about $36 million. 17 months later, in August 1991, DeVlieg Incorporated, the company left behind in that deal, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in Illinois. And buried in the court file is a detail that lands like a punch to the chest. The largest unsecured creditor standing in line was the Catherine S. DeVlieg Revocable Living Trust, the founding family, reduced to creditors of their own name. The court record never explains who Catherine was to Charles. It did not have to. The name standing in that line said enough. What followed was litigation from every direction at once. In 1993, the bankrupt company and its creditors sued Bradley, Poole, de France, and DeVlieg Bullard, alleging that the 1989 sale had been a fraudulent conveyance, that the insiders had sold the good businesses to themselves at an unfairly low price and left the debts to die with the shell. Meanwhile, shareholders who had bought into the 1990 stock offering sued from the opposite direction, claiming DeVlieg Bullard had actually overpaid. Caught between two courtrooms arguing opposite theories about the same price, the Stanwich men asked the federal courts to force everyone into a single case, and in January 1995, the Court of Appeals refused. The creditor lawsuit settled in 1996, with DeVlieg Bullard taking a $2 million charge to make it go away, and nobody admitting anything. Charles Bradley moved on to other ventures, among them a subprime auto lender, a structured settlement business that ended in bankruptcy, while payments owed to injured accident victims went into default, and an industrial holding company that filed for Chapter 11 in 2007. Draw your own conclusions about the pattern. DeVlieg Bullard itself settled into a strange and telling business model. It became a keeper of orphans, buying up the names, drawings, and parts operations of dead American machine tool builders, National Acme, New Britain, Madison, Blanchard, and more, and living off the repair parts their surviving machines still needed. It was a viable business precisely because machines like the Rigidmil refused to wear out. Tens of thousands of American machine tools from dead builders were still earning their keep in job shops from Cleveland to Los Angeles, and every one of them eventually needed a spindle bearing or a gear that only the original drawings could reproduce. There was real money in tending the graveyard, about $117 million in sales in fiscal 1998. But in late 1997, management decided to outsource the manufacture of more than 2,000 repair parts. The execution misfired, parts availability collapsed, and the customers walked. Company president Richard Sappenfield later summed up the whole episode in 5 words. Simply stated, "We blew it." You will rarely hear an executive summarize a corporate collapse without a single euphemism, and the machinists stranded by the parts shortage would not have argued with a word of it. The stock slid below $1, and NASDAQ delisted it in the spring of 1999. On July 15, 1999, DeVlieg Bullard filed for Chapter 11 with $118 million in assets against $107.5 million in liabilities, while the Federal Pension Insurance Agency filed a lien over more than $1 million in missed pension contributions. In 2000, a New York turnaround fund called KPS bought the operations out of bankruptcy for $31 million and named the survivor DeVlieg Bullard II. 4 years later, in the summer of 2004, that company filed for Chapter 11 as well, this time carrying $62 million in liabilities against under $40 million in assets, and asked the court for an orderly liquidation. 3 bankruptcies in 13 years, every one of them wearing Charles DeVlieg's name. And yet, when the liquidators sorted through the wreckage in 2004, a machine tool builder in Rockford, Illinois called Bourne & Koch stepped in and bought the DeVlieg intellectual property, every print for every part the Royal Oak engineers had ever drawn, and set up as the official source for parts, rebuilds, and even newly built machines. Over in Saginaw, Michigan, a small company called Universal DeVlieg still manufactures the microbore tooling line to this day, and out in the shops, the machines themselves simply refuse to die. Jig mills retrofitted with modern CNC controls are cutting parts for Gulfstream business jets right now. Rebuilders report that underneath the worn paint, the castings and the hand-scraped ways are usually still good, because the men in Royal Oak built in a kind of accuracy that outlasts control systems, ownership groups, and, apparently, the corporations themselves. One owner bought a decades-old 3B96 that had come out of a Boeing plant, wired up a modern digital readout beside the original controls, and pressed the old Duplitrol auto position button, half expecting nothing at all. The relays clicked, the table crept in and stopped, and the machine landed dead on 0, exactly as it had for operators who retired a generation ago. Charles DeVlieg was the son of 2 people who could not hear and could not speak, a boy who left school at 14 and learned everything by watching. He built a company and lost it to the Depression. He built a cartel to survive, and the cartel came back to take the best thing he ever made. He answered an 18-month wait by building one of the most precise machines America has ever produced, and long after his death, the financiers who inherited his name treated it like paper, and the paper burned 3 times. But walk into Greenfield Village today, and the first jig mill is sitting right there, hand-scraped ways and all. And somewhere in a job shop tonight, an operator is pressing a button on a 50-year-old DeVlieg and watching it split a tenth. The paper is gone. The iron is still holding tolerance. And that may be the most honest verdict available on this entire century of a story. Companies are agreements, and agreements can be broken in Atlantic City or in a Connecticut boardroom. 1/10 of a thousandth of an inch, scraped into cast iron by hand, is not an agreement. It does not renegotiate. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to Trade Archive right now, because the next giant of American industry is already on screen. See you in the next video.